research by the Alan Turing Institute in partnership with Lego. If you want to check this out, the research itself is called Understanding the Impacts of Generative AI's Use on Children. And it gets into, really like what are the effects of this for kids, which I think is really important, especially given what I talked about a minute ago, about how important it is to think about not just, well, how do we keep the current folks out there moving, but how do we actually prepare for the future? And so this really started to study, how are kids interacting with generative AI? How do they feel about it? Where is their benefits? Where are their risks? What is the general consensus of the adults who are involved in this? And so some statistics that came out of the research that I thought were kind of interesting, that, some of the key findings that they brought up with this was kids 8 to 12, all right, are already using these tools, and pretty frequently at that. I mean, once a month or more, 72% once a month or more. So it's a pretty frequent usage of this, and 22% as a whole. So in the age range of 8 to 12, kids 8 to 12, that's young. I mean, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 kids in that age range. And so I have a pretty keen sense of like where they are and my kids do not currently use, just so that'll be a question I get, do your kids use these things? No. Do I educate and teach and coach them on it? Yes, but they don't have access to these tools for reasons that I'm happy to talk about off camera. But 22% do. So we've already got a quarter of children in the age range of 8 to 12 who are already using this. Interestingly, there was actually more females are using it than males, which was really interesting in terms of how people are using it. Now, a lot of this is in the tools themselves. ChatGPT was the most popular, hands down, with the kids who are using it. A lot of ChatGPT users, then Gemini's coming in after that. And then a lot of it is, after that, you've got kids who are doing within their apps and things like that. Now, what was interesting is the way kids are using this is largely for fun, creative things. So when you actually dug into the research, I feel like in some ways, kids are better at understanding how to use this than adults. That, honestly, you want my biggest take from the research from Lego, is I think kids have a better understanding of the tech and the best way to use it than adults do. And you might go, well, wait a minute, Christopher, you just said kids are using it for fun, creativity, and learning. I thought we should be using this for robotic, all this other stuff. Yes, that's where it should be, taking that off of our plate. But the part that I think is actually going to bring out the best version of us is when we're engaging with it to help us, expand our creativity, when we're using it to expand some of the fun and experimentation things that we could do. Now, I also think this is very concerning that it didn't necessarily get into it in super detail, but I don't know how much parent involvement or, educator involvement is involved with some of this stuff. I did scan through some of this. They're looking at it really largely through a academic standpoint. So, obviously there's more kids in private school, which I think elevated yet another risk that we saw in this, is that equity to access is not necessarily balanced. Kids that are in a maybe less equitable environment have less access to it. So again, might this help fuel the divides of the haves and the have-nots? I think that was another really interesting thing that came to be with this. Now, I don't know necessarily of, so what do we do with that, other than we'll get to some of the things that we can be doing with it. But it's definitely much more heavily used, 52% in private schools versus 18% in state schools. So again, we see a divide of, and that's not public schools don't get it. I just know how the prioritization of public schools and where they can spend their time and the funding that they have to do stuff, they just don't have it. So it's not so much a pointing finger. It's just a reality of kids in private schools have way more access. They're using it more. We're seeing this for creativity, for learning, for experimentation, stuff like that. and a sizable population. I mean, a quarter of kids. Think if 25% are using it before they're 12 on a regular basis, you can only imagine how that's going to expand. Now, I think where that's really concerning is the fact that these tools are largely being used by children, but they were not designed with them in mind. And that's why I say, when people are like, so Christopher, do your kids have access to ChatGPT? No, they do not. Why? Well, because these tools were not designed with them in mind. It was not designed with the safeguards of them in mind. It was not designed just from a user experience with them in mind. It was not at all. And so to me, that is one big concern I have about the data itself, is that we've got a heavy population of users who are not the intended user. And then you stack in there the equity of access to it. We potentially are dividing further. And then who's actually overseeing this? Now, the question then that begs is, what does that mean for the adults who are involved? How are they feeling about it? Which was another big area of the report. 76% of parents, this was a really interesting statistic. 76% of parents, they felt really positive about kids using AI. I think that's very interesting, and I'd actually love to get deeper into the analytics of which parents, because when I talk to parents, to me, I don't know that I see that positive, but maybe it's the second half that balances it. 76 felt good about AI use with kids. 82 are extremely worried about what their kids are going to encounter, whether it's inappropriate content, whether it's misinformation. So there's almost paradox where parents are excited about AI, and yet they're very worried about what's going to happen with it. Teachers, educators, mass majority, 2/3 almost, or 3/4 almost, are very worried about what it's going to do to the critical thinking of kids. And students regularly admit they submit stuff, and these are kids. So we see higher education worried about students submitting just complete AI slop. They're already doing it as kids. So if you're not taking that seriously already, if you're a higher education person, well, you better, because the kids are already getting used to it. Now, to this, couple reactions to this. I also thought it was interesting, some of the, I also think it's funny that teachers are so concerned about kids using it and submitting things, and yet 88% of them acknowledge they're using it. So it's like, so you don't want kids to, because you think it's somehow going to, ruin them, but you're using it. Like, this again goes back to this disconnect of, it's great for me, I think it's beneficial, I just don't want anybody else using it. And this is something that I will call attention to over and over and over, that this report just continued to reveal. We got to be so careful. There is this really, really, really bad tendency to say, the way everybody's using AI is wrong. It's terrible. They're not using it right. We got to put a stop to this. The way I use it, though, on the other hand, that is good. That is so. Not only are we losing our objectivity of, are we actually critically analyzing the way we're using it, and are we applying some of these same risks to ourselves? I've talked a lot about its erosion on critical thinking. Are we as adults looking at ourselves going, hey, wait a minute, am I using this in a way that's eroding my critical thinking or not? Instead of just going, it's going to ruin the kids' critical thinking. Well, that's definitely true if the people guiding and shepherding kids are the ones who are having their critical thinking eroded by AI. It's like yelling at the kids, don't do that as you're sitting, don't do as I do as I say. Come on, we got to watch this. And then this disconnect between, I'm really worried about it, or I'm excited about it, but I'm worried about how it's going to be used. Well, this concerns me as well, in that this goes back to what I brought up in my first point. There is a growing recognition of the risks of AI. There's a growing recognition that we've got to do something. There's a growing recognition of, where it's problematic. And yet there's a lack of, so what are you doing about it? how are you actually leaning in? If you're a teacher or a parent and you're not actively educating, modeling, engaging with your kids around AI, well, that's a problem, and that's a you problem. That's not something that you go, well, we got to get the teachers to fix this. We got to get the schools to fix this. We got to get the AI companies, right? Because the parents will point the finger at the teachers. The teachers will point the fingers at the AI companies. The AI companies will point them back at the users. And there's a lot of the game of hot potato instead of going, all right, what is my sphere of influence? What can I do to help influence this in a positive way? And how can I lean in what's within my control? And I think what this report revealed is we're still in hot potato mode. We're not in action mode, which is really problematic given the fact 25% of young children are already using this. So, we need to be doing more to the so what. So what do we do about this and how do we prepare this? Now, I think one of the things that was really interesting, though, was coming into the fact I mentioned before, kids are using it for creativity. They're using it for creating images and doing this. Now, you're going to get the folks who go, I hate that. They need to learn to draw with crayons and all these other things. Maybe, and I don't think it's necessarily bad, because you see this in the results from teachers. Some teachers hate this. They think, some say it really helps bring out creativity. Others say it really harms it, because if you talk to anybody who comes from a minority group, they'll say AI does not really represent us well. And when you think about the fact that a lot of the data it's trained on is not necessarily super diverse data, so it's not surprising it doesn't represent things. So I think both can be true. Can AI help with creativity? Yes. Is it inherently going to? No, because it's not trained on and is not representative of everybody, which goes back to my other point. If we are just letting kids 8 to 12 have a ChatGPT subscription and going, go do your thing, that is a major problem. Versus if we sit and lean in with kids and go, hey, let's talk about this. Now, to some of the questions I get, well, you said you don't give your kids access to it. That is true. However, there are lots of times I will sit with my kids and I will literally work with them on, hey, let me show you how I use it. Let's do a brainstorming session. I had them help me brainstorm some creative ideas using generative AI. And we talked through, hey, how are you using it? Daddy, let me explain to you. Well, Daddy's going to explain to you, how do we write the prompt? And I actually asked them, how could we improve the prompt? What is not accurate about what's coming out of this? Where did it get it wrong? This whole coaching and mentoring, which ties back to my first point of this whole, let's just freak out about it or pretend it's not here and then hope the future generation figures it out, is not healthy. It's not healthy at all. Now, something else, so we got to be guiding this. And I think that's one thing that the report does an okay job of, but this was really more like, what do we know about it? It did have some recommendations at the end, which I'll talk through. But this one was kind of largely, hey, here's what we found. Here's what we need to potentially do. The other thing that I thought was really beneficial that I actually want to call attention to is kids with learning disorders actually benefited the most from this. And I think this is one where you actually saw a staggering difference. Kids with learning disabilities, kids who struggled, the percentage, it was like 53% versus 20%, I think, of how frequently are they using this. I can just validate this over and over and over in my own anecdotal experience and some of the research that I've seen, that AI can unlock capabilities that people frequently had struggled with in the past. There's a number of people I know who I've coached and worked with who they struggled with putting their thoughts into paper. They struggled with taking something that they had in their head and actually representing it visually. They struggled, and AI was able to do that for them. It was almost like it unlocked something they had. That, I think, is something we really need to lean into, because before it was just, okay, well, they're cognitively impaired or they have a mental disability or cognitive disability. So we'll give them an AEP or whatever. And it was kind of a unsustainable, unscalable model. And I think AI can really help with some of this stuff. And it can help, I think, level the playing field for some of the kids who historically have struggled. But that's not going to happen if we have educators who go, I don't want kids using AI, or if we just blindly let kids use it without any sort of guidance and recommendations from things. And so I think that's a huge, huge area that we could be looking at going, hey, where are the have-nots? Where are the ones who really have historically struggled? And how do we use this tool to help increase their capability? I think that's a big area we can lean into. Now, I think it's also important that we take into consideration what we saw from this research of what kids actually wanted. And this goes back to some of my points of, I think kids actually have a better pulse on how to use AI than adults often do. They care about the future of the world, and they don't like how AI, its energy impact. Kids care about that. They care about how are we getting the resources to fuel and fund this. They care about its equitable use. Kids are more skeptical of the outputs they get. And I see that with kids. Why? Kids are, in some ways, if you're a parent, you know how sometimes you want to pull out, well, I can't pull out my hair, but kids ask why. Are you sure? Explain that to me. Adults are much more vulnerable to go, yeah, good enough. Sounds right. Kids don't. And I think that's a really good thing that we should learn from kids. I think there's a lot we can learn from kids as we look at it. They don't want it to replace friendships. They don't want it to replace human connections. They are very much hey, let's keep the human community element human. I don't want an AI friend. Now, I know from other research that unchecked, they're very vulnerable to having that very easily changed, as they start struggling with feeling connected and feeling like they don't know how to connect with other people. AI can quickly fill that void, which is why I think just handing a kid an AI subscription and going, I'm sure they'll be fine, is very, very dangerous. I think this whole helping the ones who have struggled historically with the traditional environment of academia, which is why this whole, hey, kids are just using it to cheat. Cheat what, though? A lot of the ways we've assessed people's intelligence and capability is terrible. It's terrible. So to just say we're not going to let kids use it, or we are, and just get better at detecting when AI is cheating, how about we reassess the way we're evaluating effectiveness and people's capabilities? There's some real opportunity here, and AI is demonstrating it's helping either us come up with new ways of assessing, or we might need to lean in and go, well, okay, maybe somebody struggles at writing a paper because they're dyslexic, or they struggle with just being able to organize their thoughts because of ADHD or autism. Well, why wouldn't we allow AI to help them do that if it can overcome some of their challenges, if we need to get them to fit into the more traditional model or blow up the traditional model? I think there's two paths we can take, and AI can play a role in all of it. But another one they consistently saw, kids do not see themselves represented. They are far more attuned and in sync with reality than I think sometimes adults are. And that came through. And I think, as we look forward to this, some of the recommendations, they outlined 7, and I think they were really good, is, one, we need to build child-friendly AI. And whether that's new frontier models or whether we're finding ways to govern it, I'm hesitant with that, in that there's sometimes this so somebody else build a safe AI. I think where that can really work ties into one of the other recommendations is we should be including kids in this. We should be including kids in the design, including kids' input on what worked, what didn't work. Where are you seeing flaws? I think sometimes we assume the most seasoned people always have the best ideas. Historically, my experience has been actually that's not always the case. You need a balance. So I think continuing to boost literacy, inclusion of kids in design and feedback, whether we have traditional models, just kid-friendly versions, or actual kid-friendly AI models, I don't know. But I think we need to close the gap. Some of the recommendations were around fair access. How do we close those gaps? How do we increase representation through the data that is used to train these models? Things like that. How are we finding balance? I think kids more than anyone want balance. I think adults do too. Having been an educator in early years, the adults want balance too. But I think another one, and this is just where I'll close. This is not a somebody else has to take care of this for us. It's not, like I said many times, tech companies will blame the people. Leaders will blame the people underneath them. People underneath them will blame the leaders. Everybody will point. And there's a lot of finger pointing, a lot of hot potato. We got to get away from that. We just got to do. We just got to work. We got to coach the younger generation. We can't hand them a subscription. We have to sit down with them. Parents need to do that. Teachers need to do that. We need to reinvent things with kids included in that design. This is very much a collaboration that needs to happen. And I think I love Lego. I'm a big fan of the work they do. I'm not as familiar with Alan Turing, but I think one of the things that I trust them very much in, and the research is there, and I think there's a path forward. So all that to say, definitely check it out. I'd encourage you to go look it up, Understanding the Impacts of Generative AI Use on Children, if you want to see more of the specifics and details. But I think some of the biggest things are, this is an inevitability. And so we need to be preparing for, what do we do with it?